What's happening? I don't know. What is happening? These were the final words of the pilots on the doomed Air France Flight 447, seconds before it plunged into the Atlantic Ocean. Why was this happening? These pilots had thousands and thousands of flight hours, and yet they did not understand what was happening to their aircraft. This is the relationship we would like to talk about today, our relationship with automation. Is it helping us or is it hurting us? This cockpit was the Airbus A330 cockpit. It is one of the most advanced, highly technical, fly-by-wire aircraft, fully computerized. It was so advanced that it was even telling the pilots verbally what the problem was. It was saying, stall, stall, stall. It repeated this warning over 70 times as the aircraft was plunging thousands of feet per minute into the ocean. We're not here to place blame on the automation or investigate this accident. What we are here to do is to discuss this relationship and find out, even with the airplane telling the pilots the problem, why could they not understand? After this aircraft accident was investigated, training was changed, policies were changed. We were hoping it would just never happen again. Unfortunately, there have been several other accidents with stalls. Unlike an automobile, a stall in an aircraft is not related to the aircraft engine at all. A stall has to do with the lift being produced over the aircraft wing. When the wing reaches a critical angle of attack and there's not enough airflow over the wing, the airplane will not fly. It will drop. And that was what was happening on Air France Flight 447. The aircraft was in a stall. It was unable to produce lift, and it was dropping at a high rate towards the ocean. It took only 8 minutes for that aircraft from level flight at 35,000 feet to reach the ocean. Again, we want to change the relationship and find out, why does this keep happening? This was not the only accident where the pilots did not understand what was happening. Unfortunately, in 2009, there was another aircraft accident which you may have heard of, and that was Colgan Air Flight 3407. Again, it went into a stall condition, crashed into the ground, and over 50 lives were lost. This was a tragedy that we were hoping would not be repeated. Training policies were changed yet again. Unfortunately, as close as this week, we've seen in the news, the Boeing 737 MAX aircraft has been in the headlines. The Boeing 737 MAX is a new model of the 737 aircraft. The Boeing 737 is a safe, reliable aircraft. It's been around for decades. I'm sure most of you have all flown on a Boeing 737 at one point in your lives. However, with the MAX aircraft, a new technology, fly-by-wire computer system was installed called MCAS. This technology was meant to aid the pilots and help them. However, the pilots were never notified that this technology was installed on their aircraft. It was never published in any of the flight manuals, and nobody knew about it. So we saw the headlines again, unfortunately. In 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 crashed only minutes after takeoff into the sea, killing over 180 people. And they didn't know at this point what was happening with the aircraft. Again, we see the same issues repeated. Unfortunately, again, 6 months later, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 again crashed minutes after takeoff, another 737 MAX aircraft. Over 160 lives were lost. It was later investigated that the 737 MAX had this MCAS system installed on it, maneuvering characteristic augmentation system, And this was actually meant to aid the pilots in manual flight. If the aircraft reached a critical angle of attack and was no longer able to produce lift, it wanted to prevent a stall situation from occurring. So what it did is it pitched the nose over. And it did so with such a force that the pilots were unable to override it and disconnect. And that's why those aircraft are grounded. Even till today, they're still grounded, and this accident is being investigated. However, without the pilots not knowing about this system, there was no way for them to disable it and prevent it. So this is an example of automation outreaching our knowledge. This is what we need to be careful of now and in the future. These loss of control crashes have been occurring. We went back as far as 2009, all the way up until recently, and they keep occurring. We're not here to place the blame. We don't want to blame automation. We don't want to blame the manufacturers or even the operators, the pilots themselves. What we do want to do is make the sky safer and get to the bottom of this and change the relationship. How can we better understand that technology and what it is telling us? We must remember that the human element is always the most important element, even with advanced technology. A great example of this is U.S. Airways Flight 1549, the Miracle on the Hudson. Captain Sully Sullenberger and his crew had to land that aircraft without automation. There was no automation when they lost both engines. This was a major catastrophe that was averted from Sully Sullenberger and his crew. Over 155 lives were saved because they were able to take control without automation. This is a lesson that needs to be learned. Don't get me wrong, flying is still the safest form of transportation. I don't want you to have the wrong idea about flying. And in 2018 alone, there was 15 fatal aircraft accidents worldwide, with 556 lives lost. However, in comparison to U.S. highway fatalities, there was 37,000 deaths in 1 year. So we can confidently say that flying is still the safest form of transportation. But we need to rethink this relationship with automation. How can we be in control and not let automation take control of us? There has to be a way for pilots and also the public to be able to have the knowledge and the understanding of what is going on with the automation in the event it does fail. How many of you have computers that suddenly lock up? We suddenly see the wheel going round and round. We don't know what's going on behind that processor, but we do know that it's not functioning properly. This is part of the issue with automation. And we call the paradox of automation a major problem because when automation is slowly increasing, our knowledge of that automation is decreasing. So things are getting more and more complex, but we are learning less about this. For example, we will be having flying cars, probably, drones. Everything is completely automated, but yet we don't understand what functions behind the scenes. However, if something goes wrong with any of those forms of automation, we will want to learn how to take control. This is where the human element comes into play. We need to always remember that the system's knowledge is critical to the functioning of anything. For example, how many of you have a new phone? Do you know every function that your phone does? I think we're only using a small capacity of our technical devices nowadays. Although they are meant to help us, sometimes they are distractions and they're not always helping us. We can see the change in automation and the evolution over the years. We started back with 3-person cockpit crews. We had 2 pilots and a flight engineer who handled all of the systems. Then we've evolved into the 1980s and 1990s into a 2-person cockpit, 2 pilots, and yet the automation had taken over all of the duties of the 3rd person, the flight engineer. This whole panel was moved to be automated with just the 2 pilots. So now that's a lot more responsibility for the 2 pilots to fly the aircraft and also manage the automation and the systems. That's where we're evolving into. So our relationship with the engineers, the manufacturers, and the pilots has also evolved over these years. Sometimes there may need to be a little clarification in this relationship, especially as times are changing so rapidly. Back 20 years ago, when I first started flying, I flew the DC-8 aircraft. It was a 4-engine large transport jet aircraft, and I was a flight engineer. So my responsibility included the fuel system, the hydraulic system, the electrical system. And back then, the pilots and flight engineers were responsible to know every minute detail of those systems. We had to learn the temperatures, the settings, how a problem arose, and also how to fix a problem if it arose. We can see that times are changing. Back then, we even had to learn how to draw schematics of systems, such as this DC-8 fuel system. It seems a little ridiculous in today's day and age with computers that do all of this for us, but that was only 20 years ago, not so long ago, when we had this knowledge. As aviation evolved from the 3-person cockpit to the 2-person cockpit, it may someday be a single-person cockpit, or maybe even no pilot cockpit as we look ahead into the future. So the technology is evolving and increasing, but we need to make sure our knowledge is able to keep up with those changes. This is one of the newest cockpits available, a modern Boeing 787 cockpit. It's totally computerized, and it will do everything with automation, even read the checklist. So if there is a problem, it will notify the pilots, and it will also notify the pilots with a checklist on how to fix the problem. So the days of drawing out schematics and knowing every single temperature and indication, those are long gone. Computers have taken that over for us. That seems like a pretty easy thing to say. Okay, we'll sit back and let the computer take over for us. However, there are still gaps in the system. When automation takes over, sometimes the human doesn't know what's going wrong unless the automation alerts them to the problem. So we end up with gaps in our knowledge, gaps in our manual skills, and also vigilance. So these are types of issues that need to be addressed. Just in the news this week, there has been legislation that has been suggested to aid the relationship and address automation in the cockpit. This is such a current and critical issue that they're trying to pass new legislation to help us with this. Although we do not want to go back in time to days when accidents were prevalent, we do want to use technology to the best of our abilities. We would like to use the technology with our knowledge to be able to move ahead and move forward. And we would also like to maintain safer skies and also be more efficient in life. The question I'd like to ask you today, are you going to be in charge of technology, or are you going to let technology be in charge of you? Do you want to be back in the passenger seat, or would you like to be up in the cockpit and in charge of technology? Thank you.